got the audition and got Whitesnake. So things kind of transitioned. Whitesnake and Night Ranger would not really coexist.
Hey, Joel, how's it going? It's Brandon calling from Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
Hey, it's going all right.
Good. Where are you currently, Joel?
New York City.
New York. Oh, okay. I'd always thought of you as Chicago. When did you move to New York?
In 2001.
Oh, okay. So that explains the whole Rock of Ages thing then.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. When I do these, I like to start at the beginning of you as a musician and then work our way up to the new record. So going back to the beginning, where did you grow up and how did you get started in music?
So I was technically born in Iowa City, Iowa, but when I was a baby, my parents moved to the suburbs of Chicago. So that's where I grew up. And there was 2 years when I was like 19 through 21 years old, essentially, where I lived in Los Angeles. I went to guitar school out there, to Musicians Institute. GIT is like the specific when you go to guitar there at Musicians Institute at MI. And then I worked a year at Cherokee Studios out there. Kind of worked up from being a runner to being a tech. I kind of was like, on the fence about whether I was going to go back to Chicago or stay in LA. So I tried staying in LA for a little bit and things got a little weird out there, like the Rodney King riots and all that stuff. At that time I'm dating myself, but like.
Oh, so you were there. Was that kind of what was sort of the impetus to get you to move back to Chicago?
I mean, it was part of it in that, working at Cherokee was interesting and fun, but it was like minimum wage and I wasn't playing my guitar as much as I wanted to, like it was like my life was kind of like spent. It was going to be spent kind of practicing and then waiting for a big break rather than being out like kind of playing gigs and like working with my guitar every day, which seemed more my speed. So I went back to Chicago and I started teaching like 70 students a week and gigging on the weekends with my band, et cetera, and that was the way I spent the next like 8-9 years until I moved to New York to do the theater piece called Love Janis, about Janis Joplin. And so that's what I did in New York. And then that ran 2 years. And by the time that ended, I felt kind of like settled in out here. And so I never envisioned myself moving to New York, but now I've been here a very long time.
It's unbelievable. Tell me about this. So speaking about Chicago, you played with Cathy Richardson, who, has sang with Jefferson Starship. Was she also in the Janis thing as well?
Yeah, Cathy had gotten the gig when it came to Chicago, and she was Janis in it there. And then when they did a small run before New York in Sag Harbor, New York, the band needed some help and they kind of brought me in at the last minute. And one of the things I kind of lobbied for in that was like, okay, I'll come, but you have to hire me for New York, was like the prerequisite for me. So that was kind of my in, was helping them out on that, but then getting in the New York band. And so when they put up the run in New York, I think I was expecting it to go just like a couple months. It didn't last long in Chicago. It only ran a couple months there or something. So I pictured something similar in New York, and then it ended up being a 2-year run through, various circumstances. So like I said, by the time that ended, it was like, wow, okay, I live here. But yeah, Cathy, I don't know exactly what year I joined her band in Chicago anymore. But that was a nice like local Chicago break, joining her band, and that kind of led to like getting in with sessions with Jim Peterik, who lived in the area there. Jim is from Survivor at the time and Ides of March.
Oh, funny, I interviewed him, I'd say probably 6 months to a year ago. What a lovely, lovely guy, and what a songwriter.
He's a great guy, and so he had these events called World Stage, and they would happen like really just once a year, basically, and basically have, his friends out to sing their hits or maybe even a new song at these shows. And it was a lot of material. You'd have to get down like 30 songs, like these epic shows. So I would do those like once a year even when I came out here to New York, he was flying me in and I would just kind of like work on it all out here and then get off the plane and go play the show, which is no small feat because when I was playing Love Janis, that was 8 shows a week. So to, get the set together on the outside was, it was a fair amount of work. And then But that's eventually that led to the Night Ranger gig because Kelly Kagi from Night Ranger was one of the people who was a guest every year and would come out and sing 3 songs or whatever. And so eventually, when they needed somebody to fill in, they think they had a show where it was like, hey, we need. Oddly enough, my Whitesnake bandmate Reb Beach was playing guitar with them at the time, and I think Reb maybe had a show with Winger. So they were like, well, we either got to play this show one guitar, cancel it, or, and Kelly said, I know this guy with Jim Peterik that, gets off the plane and he's got all 30 songs together. And like, that was kind of my in. So that led to doing a gig with them on no rehearsal, basically. That was my audition for Night Ranger, essentially. So that's how that came to be. And that was kind of simultaneous to, it was like Midwest ties that brought me into Night Ranger more than being in New York.
That's so funny. And then you ended up staying with the band, I think it was, 6 years? Like, I know you played on Somewhere in California.
Yeah, it was 7 years. I did Somewhere in California and High Road with them. And between that, there was like an acoustic live album that we did as well, which had an odd title, 24 Strings and a Drummer. The math didn't really add up, but I didn't name it.
I was going to say, isn't there a bass player in there somewhere?
Yeah, it didn't. Under no circumstances did it add up, so it was a little bit of an odd title. But it was like 7 years, and then during that time, so I was probably with them for about 2 years, maybe a year, maybe less than that if I think about it. Maybe a year or two when Rock of Ages came to off-Broadway here. And what led to that was I had been subbing for a friend of mine in the pits, on like traditional Broadway stuff, like learning a book of music and like being in the pit. And so one of the shows that I had done, the keyboard player from that show ended up getting the music supervisor position for Rock of Ages, Ethan Pop, who's done really amazingly well in the theater world out here. And Ethan, I think, kind of remembered me from that show and said, hey, I think I know a guy that can be the guitarist in this. And when he reached out to me, I had joined Night Ranger by that point in time. He's like, oh, this is perfect. Their song is in the show, yada, yada. So the stars kind of aligned. And it was nice in that once you're past that initial period of a show opening, you can kind of sub out when you need to. So it worked out well. There was some, it was a little bit murky there in the beginning just to try and get through like previews. And when a show opens, they really want you to be there like every day. And getting through some of that was hard negotiation to be able to go play with Night Ranger still. But then once that worked out, the two fit together beautifully because I could take off when I needed to, go play with Night Ranger, come back and play the show. It wasn't too long after that then that Trans-Siberian Orchestra needed somebody. And that really became like, wow, okay, well, this is a great opportunity. What happens if I get this, though? Because come November, December, I would have to literally sub out of Night Ranger, too. So not just the show for 2 months and have somebody fill in. Broadway, that's so typical for people to sub out. They don't even bat their eye at that, I mean, that was not a problem. But subbing out of Night Ranger for 2 months every year was a little bit of a trick. But, they were cool and understood the situation. That was pretty much happening from 2010 to 2014. And then things kind of changed right in that time. Rock of Ages ended up closing. So we had a good 6 years with that, a little over 6 years of playing that show. And then right at that time, Whitesnake needed somebody and, got the audition for that and got Whitesnake. So things kind of transitioned. Whitesnake and Night Ranger would not really coexist, because there would be obviously overlap. So
I'm sure there were some shows you might even play twice in a set, so twice in a night,
Some shows.
Well, just the fact that I'm sure they play similar bills and whatnot, right? So I wouldn't be surprised. The odd night, if you stayed in both bands, you might do double duty, which I think would be kind of nuts in a way.
Yeah, I mean that was not really an option. It was really kind of like either or at that time, and I felt like Night Ranger, it had been 7 years and great opportunity and band to be a part of for me, but we were kind of doing a lot of the same stuff every year, and so I had this thing happening where we were playing the US, fly dates, and maybe go over to Japan and maybe one show in the UK or something. But, I looked at Whitesnake as an opportunity to work with David Coverdale and Tommy Aldridge and some kind of, legendary type guys, but also great catalog. And then, a big thing for me was that, they were touring the world more. It was like going to South America and Australia and lots of Europe and the UK. And so it was a great opportunity for me to get out a little bit more and get around the world. And, those were all the motivating factors for that move. And then, it had more to do with like wanting to join Whitesnake than wanting to leave Night Ranger, I would say. I was happy playing with Night Ranger and playing Rock of Ages, etc., and TSO. So then it kind of became at that time Whitesnake and Trans-Siberian. And then David needed a year off to have knee surgery. And that was when I kind of reached out to people and ended up through a friend getting recommended to fill in for Cher's guitar player. And that kind of turned in from like, hey, this is going to be a few shows to being a few years. So then for a period, it was kind of Whitesnake, Cher, and TSO, which was at first kind of easy because Whitesnake was dormant for a year. And then the first year David went back out was only a couple months. So I was subbing out of Cher to play with Whitesnake. And you can do a lot of scheduling things to try and do this stuff. Subbing out of Cher to essentially play with Whitesnake and TSO. And then that sort of hit a level in 2019 where it was just nuts because everybody was ramping up. It was like Cher took it out on the road. It wasn't just like Vegas residency stuff. Whitesnake was doing a lot, and TSO actually needed extra time for me that year. So that was a really hard year. I was on the road, I think, 285 days that year.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was a lot of being on the road that year. And not just like settling in with one thing, but hopping around with three things. So that was a crazy year. Then, of course, COVID happened, and that sort of changed a lot of the landscape of like how I was busy. It sort of brings us more to current times where I'm still technically like with Whitesnake and Trans-Siberian Orchestra, of course, Cher, it was kind of getting to the point where 2020, what I was going to be available for wasn't really acceptable. I mean, I was like available for like 20% of her shows. I think 2019, I had made 50% of them, and she kind of hung in there with that and was cool. So I give her a lot of credit that she was trying to work with me on that. And then 2020, it was looking even worse. And then as it turned out, all of it was kind of a moot point because nobody ended up playing about 3-4 months into that year. So yeah, it kind of changed. And then, for me, it's always just about finding ways to stay busy and productive. And, I did that during COVID as well. We could get into all that stuff too, if you like. But I mean, essentially right now, that's the current gig status and how that all evolves.
For sure. Well, I'd like to sort of step back in time and just sort of fill in some of the gaps with some of the other things you've done. So you mentioned TSO and joining that. Now, I know, I think it was about a decade ago, you played on Jeff Scott Soto's Damage Control. Was that sort of tangentially related to TSO? Like, were you in the West group? I think Jeff was West, correct?
Yeah, Jeff and I got to know each other. I mean, I think we first met at a melodic rock fest where he had his own band and I was playing with scrap metal. So Kelly Kagi was also a part of this thing called scrap metal. It was with the Nelson twins, who I also am friends with and do gigs with sometimes here and there. And then Mark Slaughter. So they were kind of like the core group, and then they would bring in like a lead guitarist, right?
Okay.
So that ended up being like, we were headlining the Melodic Rock Fest, and that's when I met Jeff at that. Then when I joined TSO, we saw each other at rehearsals. He tours with the West group and I tour with the East group. So we don't tour together with that, but
okay.
We get to know each other at rehearsals. And then, yeah, he ended up asking me, it was in 2011, I remember, because that was right around the time. So it was Night Ranger, Foreigner, Journey did a big tour together. And basically ended up, having him ask me at that point. I recall that was a crazy year too. I ended up really filling in Foreigner for Mick Jones too for a bit. He went down with an illness on that tour, and I kind of had really short notice, like a day's notice to get it together and beyond. And I did indeed do that double duty thing you were talking about, where it was like I was on stage with Night Ranger, and then 20 minutes later I was walking back out there with Foreigner. So it was really
change your shirt and all right, go out there again.
Yeah, kind of a bizarre situation. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the story there. So he asked me to do that, and Jeff and I have really had a good relationship ever since. I mean, we've ended up working together on various things over the years. He's, one of the top pros in the business, and super nice guy. I consider Jeff to be a good friend. I mean, we've been working at this for a while, doing, not necessarily in a quote unquote band together, but of course, he sings on my albums, on the Joel Hoekstra's 13 albums. So.
Yeah. Now, tell me this. A little bit after that, obviously, you doing musicals, I guess, makes sense for how you came to do this. But you worked with Amy Lee on the War Story soundtrack. Tell me about doing that.
So that came about one of my instrumental albums that I made. So I did 3 instrumental albums when I was younger, and the third one was an acoustic album. And I wanted to add some strings, and I had a friend say, this guy Dave Egger in town does it for, like rock bands, and he'll just make an arrangement. And so I had him play on my acoustic album, and we kind of forged a little bit of a friendship through that. And at some point, Dave started working with Amy on a lot of stuff. And it was something that was, really related through Dave. I think there was just one guitar track that she wasn't happy with. They had somebody in to do, and, it was one of those situations where they listened back and it was like, yeah, this didn't do it for her or whatever. So Dave said, I know this guy, he plays in, at that time, I think I had joined Whitesnake. So, in town, and she was like, all right, cool, let's have him in. And so, Amy and I forged a little bit of a friendship through that. She's always great to me. And one time, Whitesnake, there was a little bit of a tour overlap between Evanescence and Whitesnake, and they treated me like $1 million when I went by to visit. And Amy's always been really nice to me.
I've been backstage with Evanescence, and they're literally probably the coolest band on the planet. I mean, everybody in that band is so down to earth and just incredible. Yeah,
they're really nice people. I mean, Will Hunt is a slamming drummer, man. He's great, and we got to work together. Finally, he was kind of playing with, I guess, what you'd call Vince Neil's band at the time. They have a name for it. I think Music Mafia or something like that. And but we did, that was my first gig kind of back out of COVID, was going down to, I think it was the Houston area, somewhere in Texas, and flew down and played at this, guy who has literally a really pro facility stage in his backyard, and throws these giant parties. And so anyway, I went down there and played a little mini set of Whitesnake with those guys. So, Will is awesome, and Jen and I got to be friends too. They're guitarists too. I think she's not with the band now, but we got to be friends through hanging out at that Indianapolis show. And yeah, they're really nice people.
Yeah, Jen I can't say enough great things. I mean, everybody in the band, but Jen, I think, was just a whole other level of
super positive, friendly person. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so 2017, you played on an album with a really good friend of mine, Tony Mills. Tell me about working on his Streets of Chance album. What specifically did you do on that? Was it just a couple solos, or did you write with him?
He just asked me to play on a couple tracks on there. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Tony and I literally never met. So we just corresponded. And I was, at that time, I think in Vegas doing stuff for Cher. And I just basically did it in the hotel room, recorded the tracks for the songs. But, he was a very talented guy, and our interactions were great. He seemed to be a very friendly guy. So it's very sad that he passed, but obviously getting the opportunity to do is something I'm happy that I had the chance.
For sure. All right, so before we talk the new record, one more thing I want to ask you is you played on the original Whitesnake album, Flesh and Blood, and I know you contributed to writing, I think it was about half the songs, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, there was a little more than, I think, so one of them ended up being the bonus track for the record, and so there was 6, and then there was one that for whatever reason wasn't on the album and then got used on like I think it was released on the Rock album. That was, so 7. I ended up like co-writing 7 songs with David during that period. I at least, got some experience with him with that. And that was, really nice of him to include me.
Yeah. When you wrote with him, did you just sort of send him like a couple tracks, hey, listen to this and sing? Or did you guys sit down in a room and actually put the songs together kind of thing?
Yeah, I think we were in a situation where he had a lot of ideas. So yeah, I did give him like some of the riffs, and a lot of that stuff ended up on like the second Joel Hoekstra's 13 album, like on Running Games. Like a lot of those riffs I gave to him, but I think, he had ideas. So a lot of it came down to like Reb and I, either together or separately, kind of completing his ideas with him. For Flesh and Blood, I would say, is more the bulk of the album. There's a couple songs where it had more to do with, like writing the whole riff, like bed for him to sing on. But in general, that's the way it kind of worked out, like designated music for it. A lot of writing with him would be like he had a chorus, and then he'd say, where are we going from there? And then you kind of hash that out around his desk at the studio house, and then Reb and I would head into the studio area of it and actually demo it with like a basic drum beat or whatever, and demo it up for everybody. And that was the way. And we, Whitesnake was still in the school of like working up demos. And so you'd have a demo, and then everybody would come in and properly cut it. Obviously, that stuff always starts with drums. For those that don't know, Tommy Aldrich would be the first person to record, and then everybody kind of records for real on top of that.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I've made a couple records, and every time I've done it has always been drums first, playing to the demo, and then you do everything proper after. And it's interesting, the last couple of years I've interviewed people, more and more I'm hearing people are doing it the other way, where everyone's playing to like the click or fake drums, or even the drummer will sort of half-ass play them, then do the record, and then the drummer will come in last and put them down, which I've always thought was really interesting, because as a guitar player, I want the drums there.
Yeah, that's a hard one, because, depending on the drummer, drummers tend to like play around the click. So especially a lot of drummers play behind a click, those that don't know, like, so there's a little bit of like a pocket or bed, and that can, as a guitarist, that can make you sound like you're playing ahead of the beat. Once you're not hearing the click anymore and you're only hearing the drums, it can be like, all right, well, this guy's rushing. So I like to have the drums for cutting the real stuff. There are occasions on my albums where I've cut the scratch guitars, what you lay down as a guide for people to record to, but it's assumed that you're going to wipe them. And then there are times on my albums where I've left those in and added, where Vinny Appice will record, and then I'll say, you know what, scratch guitars still sound good. So I think even one of the tracks on the Revolution Saints album that came out was my scratch guitars existed for the rhythms.
Oh, that's funny. Now, do you just do everything DI and then reamp it later kind of thing if you're going to keep it?
Yeah, do like, DI and modeling. Usually I'm in New York City, so the concept of like miking up the half stack or whatever is not really realistic.
Yeah.
It's for many reasons, the neighbors hearing it, and also just the noise, it's like just to be able to have a quiet environment to record in is really hard to obtain in New York City. And I actually don't mind it. I like the remote thing. It gets a bad rap. People like to say, like, imagine if they were all in the room together. And it's like, man, people don't want to like do a million takes when everybody's in the room. You tend to settle and go like, it's fine, because you don't want to hold up the process. So in my experience at home, when you're working on your own and it's designated work on that, you can be a little bit more of a perfectionist and get really what you want out of yourself. So I do my best work in that environment. The remote recording, I would say, works better for me. I think it does for most musicians, if everybody's totally honest,
Yeah. Well, I heard, Eric, who's now singing for Skid Row, and he did their whole new album he learned how to record himself for that record. And he's like, you know what? I never want to be in a studio again. He's like, let me sing it a million times where I can actually get it right, as opposed to, the pressure being on, right? So
yeah, everybody's paying, a lot of money to be in a studio. And then there's also everybody's there and people aren't as critical of you as you like. We're all our own worst critics, I think, as musicians. So there's times where I'll keep going and keep going. And also I kind of have fun with it, to be honest. Like when it comes to like cutting a solo for an album, it's kind of fun to like put up the solo section and jam on it for an hour and kind of collect ideas. And then you end up kind of building a rough idea of what the solo is going to be just through jamming and finding things that work better. And that's a luxury you don't have in the studio either. So it's not exactly like popular to say that the remote thing is great. Everybody's got that whole wanting everybody to be together in the room. And it's like, yeah, on a level, it's cool because you end up with like a vibe, but like also on a level, you lose, everybody's best individual work, I think. Or you compromise it.
Yeah, well, I mean, at that point, it almost becomes like a live album. And I mean, I guess a lot of our favorite songs are that way, all the stuff we grew up on. But like you say, it's just not feasible. And now it's easier than ever to interact with anybody all over the world.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of positives to the remote thing. Yeah, that being another one, like you said, it's like just logistically to get things done. This digital age has shrunk the world. And I think that's a good thing for people. Like, when I was younger and that wasn't available and in the suburbs of Chicago, it was like you needed to like either like get yourself to LA or get yourself to New York or something where people were going to have contacts, Nashville, etc. Nowadays, there's not a ceiling on your dream. If you're a great guitarist, let's say you're living in Montana or something, you can still make things happen. So online. And I think that's a positive, I think, for a lot of the great musicians out there and a reason that we see and hear so much more talent, like, online when you scroll through and you see all these great players, those players were always out there. They were just getting buried years ago because there was no ability to build a career out of some of their local areas, And that would perhaps be a good segue to like a lot of the COVID stuff for me, was without the digital age, I don't know what I would have done. I taught virtually. The way I decided to kind of go about making my living was taking on I did 31 students a week throughout that whole period, that 2020 and 2021. And basically doing the teaching and doing cameos for people, which was a very real thing, and doing collab videos. And that was a big thing. So like the collab videos, definitely, those ended up getting a ton of views. I mean, like Dino Jalusic and Mike Portnoy and myself doing Jane, that's, got 1.4 million views or something like that. And I also did, Foreplay Long Time with Dino and Mike and some other really talented guys. And then there was Stormbringer that I did with Dino and Virgil Donati and Tony Franklin. And then I did Abracadabra, which was the Stormbringer I produced, and then the Abracadabra I produced to have a collection of guys, Arnel Pineda from Journey and Billy Sheehan probably being the most recognizable names from those guys that I worked with on that. But all those videos just got a ton of views, and that was able to keep me like somewhat relevant and out there. And that and being able to release running games from Joel Hoekstra's 13 during that time really helped a lot as well.
Yeah, it's like for the rest of the world, everybody went insane being at home, and every musician's like, good, I can practice and I can write and record more.
Yeah, if anything, I would say I almost got busier during those times because teaching that much, and then a lot of people were recording, and I still do get asked to do a lot of guest solos for people where, people want me to just throw a solo on a song on their album or whatever so they can say guest soloist or whatever. Special guest, etc. So I get a lot of those. And so, yeah, doing the session work and like I said, all that stuff put together, I was like, man, I'm slammed. Like I was really busy, and it was what was odd about it was all right in my apartment.
So cool. There you go. Yep, it's being in one little place and yet you're worldwide all at once. Yeah, it's funny. I was scrolling through all your collab videos and I realized I've watched almost every one you mentioned. I was like, oh, yep, there's Jane, there's Stormbringer. All right, let's talk the new record. So it was about 2015, I think it was, where you put together Joel Hoekstra's 13. And each album, you've had a core group of Jeff Scott Soto on sort of second vocals or whatever, Vinny on drums, Tony Franklin on bass, Derek Sherinian on keyboards. And the first two you had Russell Allen sing for. How did the band initially come together?
So Tony Franklin and I had done a lesser-known project that we were a part of called VHF with an old roommate of mine from LA, Todd Vinciguerra on drums, and that was recorded very interesting. Like, and Todd just basically laid down like drum grooves, and then Tony improvised to those, and they gave me these bass and drum tracks, and were like, "Can you play to this, and let's release it as like a trio thing." And so I ended up doing lots of layers and weird sounds, and it's mainly instrumental music, but there's videos for that stuff online. But Tony and I did that project, and then I said, right around that time, obviously I was getting more well known from the rock bands, doing like Night Ranger and Rock of Ages, and so all the fans were kind of going to my solo albums going, let's check out his solo albums. And it was this kind of like, jazz fusion or like, easy listening instrumental acoustic stuff. And they were like, hey, you ever think about releasing a rock album? It was like, yeah, I definitely want to do that. So anyway, I went to Tony with that and said, who would you want to use on drums? And he recommended Vinny, and Vinny and I had never even met. But I was like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I mean, I grew up on Holy Diver and Last in Line, and so that was like kind of the core trio. And then right at that time, Russell Allen joined Trans-Siberian Orchestra. So hearing him, like, Chris Caffrey from TSO was sending me clips of Russell singing, and I was like, wow, this guy would be the perfect singer. So I asked him to do it. And, at that time, Jeff, I think I just said like, hey, would you ever want to sing backgrounds on an album? And he was into doing that for me because, we're friends. And I was like, why I could do it myself, but it's going to be like pretty good and it will take a long time, or I can get like somebody great to do it. So Jeff ended up being a big part of the sound. And then Russell had scheduling things happening. And so we ended up having Jeff sing the second half of like the lead vocals on Dying to Live. And that seemed to be like a well-received album, but was like the one thing that the critics kind of said, like, I don't get it. 2 lead singers, what's the deal? So with Running Games, I said, all right, well, let's see if we can get this done with Russell and singing lead and Jeff singing backups. And, that just ended up taking a really, really long time for Russell to get done. And when it came time for Crash of Life, it was like, man, I don't know if I have another one of those time periods in me where I can go that long. And, the other thing with Russell is that unless it's like a band and he's really part of the writing, he doesn't really want to do like promotion for it. He doesn't want to do videos and things like that. So, in talking with Frontiers, they turned me on to Girish, who sang on this record, Girish Pradhan. In first hearing him, I was like, well, he's amazing. His band Girish and the Chronicles, they obviously cool that they're like, out of India. They're this hard rock band, but I would say like his singing on that kind of reminds me more of like early Skid Row.
I was going to say, I've always called them the Indian Skid Row.
Yeah, they're kind of like, like a lot of high screaming and stuff. And I'm like, okay, that's great. He's amazing. But like, the model for this has always been more like Ronnie James Dio through like Lou Gramm or Paul Rogers are kind of more my ideal singer would be like a mashup of those three guys, And so I ended up sending him the material and just seeing how he would do. And he's really a chameleon and can really do, I think, a lot more than people recognize. So that's really evident on the album. There's lots of stuff where he doesn't fall back on the range and the screaming and things like that, where he's more about the expression and singing the melody of the song. And so it just worked out. He did his tracks and I was blown away. And, I think he's a really, really talented guy. So he's got a bright future ahead. And so there you go. That's kind of how the lineup came together for this, as opposed to like, having Russell sing again.
Yeah, I put the tracks on without knowing who the singer was at first. I was expecting Russell, and he does sound enough like Russell that as I had it on in the background, I wasn't really paying attention. I was like, oh yeah, it's just more of the same look. I'm like, wait, that's not Russell. So I mean, he did such a great job in that regard to get that sort of gruffer kind of singing style, still very melodic, but definitely not the sort of softer, high screaming kind of stuff, So, like you say, very, very chameleon to his voice.
Yeah, he's definitely very versatile.
So I'll say this album, at least to me, feels a little bit heavier than the last two.
I would say there was stuff that was that heavy on Dying to Live, that Dying to Live was more varied like this one. I say this one went back to being more varied. Running Games was a little bit more like, I'd say, focused in terms of like, hey, let's go with one style. But honestly, I kind of like it the more varied way. So Frontiers kind of just said, look, everything you do is good. Just make an album. And, I appreciate that. So I think, there's definitely some really heavy tracks, Far Too Deep, Everybody Knows Everything, Damaged Goods. But there's also ballads, and like Through the Night and Over You and Torn Into Lies, which is up as well as a video in addition to Far Too Deep. So I think there's a lot of variety on the record, and it's really difficult to promote in that regard because, everybody hears a song and they go, okay, so it's going to be 12 songs of that. But honestly, there's a lot of variety.
No, I mean, my all-time favorite records all have variety to them.
Me too.
I don't know too many albums I want to listen to like that. That's great. Give me a great slam and hard rock song or metal tune or whatever, but I don't need 12 to be exactly the same. Otherwise, I just listen to the one song 12 times.
Exactly. I feel the same way. Yeah.
Now tell me about Damaged Goods. I absolutely love the solo section in that song. Like, it's a great song in its own right, but I think I've gone back about 5 times to listen to that solo section. I think is that sort of crazy arpeggio, and then you're sort of interplaying with Derek a little bit in that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually have to pull up the solo section right now to recall offhand, to be honest. It's been a second since I listened to Damaged Goods, but, that was like a riff that Michael Sweet had asked for some ideas for one of his solo albums, and that was one of the ones he didn't use that I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. That would fit on a Joel Hoekstra's 13 album when I was like kind of collecting riff ideas for this record. And so that's kind of where it originated, was something that at the time I had written going, maybe this will be like a good Michael Sweet track. So, for me, the main riff almost has like an Iron Maiden kind of thing to it.
Yeah.
I would say, I don't know. It's definitely a heavy track, The stuff comes together through various influences, but thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, so you've got, so the new record just came out. Is there anything else in the pipeline that we can plug, or any way, ways that people can sort of get in touch with you, that kind of thing, to follow you and see what you're doing?
I mean, I think, I'd love people to check out the Revolution Saints album, Eagle Flight, that came out April 21st. That's something new that I'm a part of. And I also have the riffs over to Michael Sweet for the next Iconic album, so that ended up becoming another Frontiers recording with, Tommy Aldridge, Michael Sweet, myself, Marco Mendoza, and Nathan James. So that second one is in the works. I'd love if people checked out Eagle Flight from Revolution Saints, and obviously I'd love if they would check out Crash of Life. Mainly gigging-wise this year, I'm out doing acoustic shows at Brandon Gibbs. We just did a 2-week run of the UK. We got a nice week or two coming up here in the US, and we're doing Europe later this year, I believe. So people can keep their eyes open for that. And playing with Broadway's Rock of Ages band, which is the band going out playing the full-length versions of the songs. And those are just good fun. So people can look for me playing with that live, and teaching remotely, counseling at Rock and Roll Fantasy Camp. These are all things that I'm doing this year. It's an odd year with Whitesnake kind of putting, the farewell tour on hold for the moment and kind of waiting to see what's next with that. So that's everything that's happening.
Fantastic. Well, Joel, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out to do this. Absolutely loving the new record. I think I've had the promo for a few months, so every week or two I would go back to it and just keep playing it. I was blown away, especially hearing Girish, hearing him in that style just completely floored me. And the whole thing's fantastic. Are you planning on doing another one?
Yeah, I think there's definitely going to be more coming from it. There seems to be, more momentum forming with this record, being able to do the videos and whatnot with Girish. And So I think there'd probably be a couple more. I think all of these, there's already a second Revolution Saints album with this lineup recorded. And like I said, iconic. So yeah, I think, probably see, the next few years pretty active with being able to do that stuff. And, just kind of keep going. I have obviously Trans-Siberian Orchestra coming up November, December as well. So.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thanks again for doing this. Best of luck with everything you've got going on, and I'll keep an eye on all your future projects coming out.
Thanks so much, brother. Appreciate it, man.
All right. Thanks, Joel. Have a good one.
Have a great one. Okay. Bye-bye.